Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your essential reading material and turn it into actionable, synthesized knowledge.
Today, we are strapping ourselves into the time machine.
We are indeed, and we're tackling a movement that, it didn't just shift Western civilization, it fundamentally rebuilt it. We're talking about the Age of Enlightenment.
Also known as the Age of Reason. And, it's so much more than just a historical period. It's really the intellectual engine room of the modern world.
That's a great way to put it.
If you want to understand where we got concepts like democracy or universal human rights or even, free market economics.
Or even just the structure of modern science itself.
Exactly. You have to start here, back in the 18th century.
So our mission for this deep dive is to quickly but really thoroughly unpack the core principles. We're talking about reason, empirical evidence.
The scientific method, of course.
Right. And then follow that trail and see how those ideas led to these, radical and often, frankly, terrifying shifts across politics, society, religion, you name it. We're not just, listing names and dates.
No, we're trying to figure out why. Why were these ideas so explosive?
And we have a really fascinating and kind of contested chronology to navigate here.
We do. The roots of this whole intellectual revolution, they start to emerge in the late 17th century in Western Europe. But the movement, it really hits its stride, its peak in the 18th century.
And it spreads.
It spreads everywhere, rapidly across the continent and then into the European colonies, which fundamentally shapes the future of places like the Americas and Oceania.
The starting date itself is actually debated, which I think immediately highlights the philosophical split that's right at the heart of this whole movement. Where do we even begin?
Well, some historians will point to René Descartes and his discourse on the method back in 1637.
And his famous line, cogito, ergo sum.
I think, therefore I am. And they see this as the start because it relocated the whole basis of knowledge, what they call the epistemological basis.
Which is just a fancy way of saying how we decide what's true, right?
Yeah, exactly. It moved it away from external authority, like the church or tradition, and planted it firmly inside your own mind, an internal certainty.
That is a huge shift.
It's the genesis of rationalism, this idea of systematic doubt. But then others, they mark the start later. They prefer to focus on the empirical side of things.
So they'd point to Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica in 1687.
Precisely. They see that as the definitive moment, the point where empirical reasoned inquiry, backed up by mathematics, was proven to unlock the fundamental laws of the entire universe.
It's a fantastic way to frame the whole era, isn't it? Is knowledge found primarily through the internal workings of your mind, or is it derived from the external observation of nature?
That's the core tension. And as for the end date, well, traditionally, European historians would date the period from the death of Louis XIV in 1715 right up to the French Revolution in 1789.
But that's shifted a bit.
It has. If you look at the intellectual output, a lot of modern historians push that end date a bit later. They often cite the death of the philosopher Immanuel Kant in 1804 as a more fitting intellectual cutoff point.
So regardless of the exact bookends, the big picture here is just it's profound. This era was promoting these genuinely revolutionary ideals. Individual liberty, the whole concept of progress.
Religious tolerance, natural rights. These were concepts that directly challenged the prevailing structures of absolute monarchy.
And crucially, the political and social authority that the church held.
That challenge just set the groundwork for massive, massive change. By questioning the divine right of kings and the divine origin of knowledge, the Enlightenment basically fostered an environment where all these new political and social theories could just flourish.
And the sources are really clear on this. The intellectual heritage of all those later 19th century movements like modern liberalism and even some forms of socialism.
It all traces right back to the foundational debates of the Enlightenment. It was a true pivot point in history.
Okay, so let's unpack that shift. Let's look at the foundations. You really can't talk about the Enlightenment without first acknowledging that it was standing on the shoulders of the scientific revolution that came just before it.
Absolutely. It wasn't born out of nothing. It was more of an applied expansion of methods that were already there.
Thinkers like Galileo, Kepler,
Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
They had already laid out the blueprint. The Enlightenment inherited and then just massively expanded upon these new methods.
Like empirical inquiry, gaining knowledge through observation and testing.
And rigorous reductionism, breaking complex systems down into their smallest, most verifiable parts. And, of course, the scientific method itself.
It seems like the biggest gift the scientists gave the philosophes was just confidence.
That's it. The confidence that human reason could decode the universe. the confidence that the universe operated according to discoverable laws.
And speaking of blueprints, the philosophical foundation was really laid by thinkers who created this kind of dualistic starting point.
Right. On one side, you have Sir Francis Bacon, who championed empiricism.
He insisted that all knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience, from observation.
For Bacon, you just can't trust deductive logic on its own. You have to test, you have to observe, you have to categorize.
And then on the complete opposite side, you've got René Descartes with his very powerful rationalism.
And his method began not with the external world, but with doubt, systematic doubt. He realized the only thing he couldn't possibly doubt was the act of doubting itself.
Which leads to his foundational cogito ergo sum.
And this created a dualistic doctrine. He separated the realm of the immaterial thinking mind, the res cogitans, from the realm of physical extended matter, the res extensa.
So this intellectual wrestling match, between innate internal reason and external sensory experience, that really defined a lot of the early Enlightenment.
It did, until Locke came along and immediately complicated Descartes' dualism.
Right. John Locke, he picked up that torch of skepticism, but he took it in a very different direction.
He did. Instead of focusing on internal certainty, he went back to external experience. He refined empiricism in his huge work, the Essay Concerning Human Understanding.
This is where he introduces the idea of the mind as a tabula rasa.
A blank slate.
Yeah.
He suggested the mind starts out empty, and it just absorbs experience, and that experience is the sole source of knowledge.
And that idea was just incredibly powerful, wasn't it?
Oh, it was huge, because it implied that human nature was malleable. It wasn't fixed by divine decree, and so it could be improved.
Through better education, a better environment.
Precisely. So if Descartes was asking, what is the one thing I know for sure? Then Locke was asking, how do we actually learn anything in the first place? Exactly. And then later, you get David Hume, who comes along in the 1740s and continues this trajectory, deepening the skeptical tradition so much that he starts to question the very basis of cause and effect. He asks if we can ever truly know anything about the world outside of our own perceptions.
So this debate created this rich, dynamic, intellectual environment, but it led to a schism pretty quickly.
It did. And this is where it gets really interesting, because this philosophical starting point led to a fundamental split in Enlightenment thought. The historian Jonathan Israel has highlighted this really well.
He argues there were two distinct competing lines of thought.
Yes. First, you have what he calls the moderate Enlightenment. This school followed figures like Descartes, Locke, and the German philosopher Christian Wolff.
And their approach was?
Compromise. They were looking for reform, abolishing some superstition, promoting better government. But they were always trying to accommodate the traditional power structures and faith.
So they were often deistic, believing in a creator God who just sort of wound up the clock and let it run.
Right. They believed in a God who set the universe in motion, but didn't intervene directly. Their goal was to make the existing house more modern and habitable, but without tearing down the walls of the church or the monarchy.
So they were reformers, but cautious reformers. They valued stability just as much as progress.
Precisely. They wanted to rationalize faith. But the second path, that was the radical Enlightenment.
And this movement drew its energy from Baruch Spinoza.
The Dutch philosopher, yes. His work, which was published after he died, asserted the uncompromising unity of matter.
The unity of matter. What does that actually mean in practical terms, and why on earth was it so radical?
It meant that God and nature were one and the same thing, a concept called monism or pantheism.
Which is a direct and, I imagine, terrifying challenge to Descartes' mind-body dualism.
And to all traditional religious teachings which rely on a transcendent God who intervenes. If God is just the universe itself, then there's no room for miracles or revelation or a separate heaven and hell administered by a church. It functionally secularizes everything.
That seems like an immediate non-starter for any ruling power whose legitimacy is tied to the church.
It was, and politically and socially, the radicals just took this logic to its absolute limit. They pushed for democracy, complete individual liberty, total freedom of expression.
And the eradication of religious authority from public life.
Completely, including state-sponsored religious education. And critically, this radical tendency, it separated the basis of morality entirely from theology. It argued that morality comes from human reason and social necessity, not from divine command.
Which meant, terrifyingly for the moderates, that an atheist could be a perfectly moral person.
Right. So the moderates were trying to create an enlightened monarchy and an enlightened Christian society. But the radicals were fundamentally anti-clerical and pro-democracy. They were advocating for a fully secular state.
And that tension, that dynamic, it explains so much. It explains why the French version of the Enlightenment, which we often associate with figures like Diderot fighting censorship, was so much more volatile and revolutionary than, say, the English or German versions.
Exactly. It was the difference between those who wanted to refine the existing structures and those who saw reason as this singular, uncompromising force that required those structures to be demolished and rebuilt from the ground up.
Now, let's pivot to the hard sciences. It's so clear that science wasn't just some theoretical hobby. It was integral to the whole identity of the Enlightenment.
Well, completely. Scientific advancement was seen as the ultimate tool for overthrowing religious and traditional authority. It was proof that progress was real and achievable through free speech and rational thought.
The Enlightenment valued empiricism and rational thought as, these essential tools for advancement,
And they categorized the systematic study of science under this big heading of natural philosophy,
which was then divided into physics.
which dealt with mathematics and universal laws like Newton's work, and then this other massive kind of jumbled up mixture of chemistry and natural history.
A conglomerate grouping, as the sources put it. And natural history included everything from anatomy and biology to geology. Why did they lump all of those together?
Well, largely because the tools and the methods hadn't really specialized yet. I mean, chemistry was still trying to distinguish itself from alchemy, and fields like biology and geology were mostly about classification and observation, cataloging things.
They hadn't developed that same rigorous reductionist methodology that Newton had applied to physics.
Not yet. But this emphasis still led to some incredible, tangible results. You see Antoine Lavoisier's experiments being used to create the first modern chemical plants in Paris, which sets the stage for industrial production.
Or you think about the pure spectacle of it all. The Montgolfier brothers launching the first manned hot air balloon flight in 1783.
Imagine seeing that. It's a visible, breathtaking demonstration that human reason could master the laws of nature and literally defy gravity.
And this wasn't just about discovery, it was about the structure of knowledge itself. The old universities, which were still rooted in scholasticism.
That rigid, authority-based medieval method of learning.
Right. They were largely bypassed and replaced by these new scientific societies and academies.
And these weren't just informal clubs. They were official institutions, often chartered by the state or by wealthy patrons, to provide technical expertise and advance practical knowledge.
So knowledge creation literally moved out of the cloister and into these organized public-facing institutions like the Royal Society of London or the Academy of Science in Paris.
This institutional change was absolutely fundamental. The sources really highlight this. The main function of the university was now seen as just the transmission of existing knowledge. But these new academies, they were understood to create new knowledge.
Bernard de Fontenelle even called the 18th century the Age of Academies.
He did. He noted that by 1789, there were over 70 official scientific societies across Europe.
And the popularization of this science was massive. You had figures like Voltaire and his mistress, Émilie du Châtelet.
Who was a brilliant scientist in her own right.
Absolutely. They worked to popularize Newtonianism. They translated and explained these incredibly complex ideas, making sure these discoveries weren't just confined to a small, mathematically inclined elite.
They brought it into the mainstream intellectual dialogue. It became cultural currency.
You even had poets like James Thomson writing a poem to the memory of Sir Isaac Newton, praising his science.
Right. And even though you had figures like Rousseau who criticized the sciences for distancing man from nature, the overall narrative was clear. Science meant progress, and progress meant the overthrow of old, limiting ways of thought.
So this whole comprehensive intellectual effort, from that dualistic starting point in philosophy to the concrete institutionalized results in science, is really what made the Enlightenment such a transformative force.
So if that first section established the reason and empiricism as the tools,
then this section deals with the what they actually built with those tools. And when Enlightenment thinkers applied reason to the idea of governance, the result was just an utterly explosive, direct challenge to the entire political order of the West.
Absolutely. The central political doctrines that emerged were things we now take for granted. Individual liberty, representative government, the rule of law, religious freedom.
But at the time, these stood in direct systemic contrast to absolute monarchy, to rule by divine right, and to state-controlled religious persecution.
And the foundational debate that really underpinned all of this was the concept of the social contract. This idea just permeated the entire era.
It really gets its start with Thomas Hobbes and his massive work Leviathan back in 1651.
Hobbes is so fascinating because he developed the fundamentals of liberal thought, but he used them to argue for absolute sovereignty. It's a strange paradox.
He shocked people by arguing for the natural equality of all men and the existence of individual rights.
Even more radically, he stated that political order is artificial. It's created by humans, and any legitimate power has to be representative and based on the consent of the people.
All in an effort to escape the brutal state of nature, a war of all against all.
So he establishes the ground rules. Consent is necessary, equality exists, and the state is artificial, not divinely ordained. But his conclusion,
That people must surrender all their rights to an all-powerful sovereign.
that's where he diverges so sharply from the later thinkers.
And that's where John Locke comes in. He becomes the most influential social contract theorist for all the revolutionary movements that followed.
He does. In his two treatises of government, Locke completely redefined the state of nature. For him, it wasn't some brutal chaos. It was a condition where men are rational and they follow natural law.
And the core tenet of that natural law was Locke's famous assertion that all men are born equal and possess these inalienable natural rights: life, liberty, and property.
And for Locke, the entire point of civil society, the whole reason for government, was simply to protect those rights, which he argued pre-existed the state.
So people enter this social contract, they cede a little bit of power, specifically to gain access to an unbiased judge, like a court system, to resolve disputes and protect their property without it all descending into war.
Exactly. The government is basically just a trustee. Its power is limited.
And his definition of property was revolutionary too, wasn't it? The idea that your natural right to property comes from your own labor, mixing one's labor with the land.
That became a cornerstone, not just of liberal political thought, but of the emerging liberal economic theory. And you just can't overstate Locke's tangible historical impact.
His formulation, life, liberty, and property, was directly echoed in the American Declaration of Independence.
Even though Jefferson famously swapped out property for the more abstract pursuit of happiness. And Locke's ideas were also fundamental in shaping the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen.
Then you get Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who comes along and complicates the contract dramatically. He almost flips it on its head.
He does. He argued that civil man is corrupted by society and social artifice, and that natural man is self-sufficient and good.
So for Rousseau, the contract wasn't just about protecting rights you already have. It was about achieving a higher form of collective moral freedom.
Right. People join civil society not just for protection, but to achieve a kind of unity while still preserving individual freedom, which is a very tricky balance.
And that goal is embodied in his concept of the general will. What exactly was the general will, and how did it function compared to Locke's idea of limited government?
Well, Locke believed government authority had very narrow limits based on consent. Rousseau, on the other hand, he emphasized a kind of communal sovereignty. Citizens submit to the general will, which is the interest of the community as a whole, and that will is always right.
The state becomes a moral agent.
It does. And this is where it gets really controversial. For Rousseau, if a citizen disagrees with the general will, he's just mistaken. He's mistaken about what his own true self-interest is, and he must be forced to be free, forced to obey the collective moral sovereignty.
Wow, that is a very high-stakes version of the social contract. It sounds like it could justify some pretty intense state action in the name of moral unity.
It certainly could, and it creates this massive tension in Enlightenment thought. You have Locke leading toward a more limited individualist idea of freedom, and Rousseau leading toward this collective moral unity.
But it's important to remember that not everyone even bought into this contractual model at all. We have to acknowledge the critics.
Especially those from the Scottish Enlightenment. David Hume, for instance, argued powerfully against the idea of some founding contract in his essay of the original contract.
Right. He basically said governments rarely, if ever, actually derive from explicit consent.
He said they're grounded in habitual authority, in military force, in long custom. Subjects consent tacitly because the ruler already has authority, not because they all sat down and signed an agreement. He thought the whole idea was a useful political fiction, but not a historical reality.
And Adam Ferguson mirrored that skeptical view. He completely rejected the idea that citizens built the state in some single abstract contractual moment.
Ferguson argued that polities grew organically out of gradual social development, not some philosophical decision. He developed the extremely popular four stages of progress theory to explain this.
Humanity moves from hunting and gathering to pastoral to agricultural.
And finally to a commercial and civil society. For him, the structure of government just reflects the stage of economic development. It was a totally sociological, non-contractual way of explaining political order.
Which reframes the entire discussion, doesn't it? It moves it from abstract philosophy to what is essentially early sociology.
It does. Now, moving from theory to practice, this era saw the rise of something called enlightened absolutism.
This was the ultimate compromise, really. The idea that absolute monarchs could apply these new, rational, enlightened principles to reform their states and actually strengthen their rule.
They often claimed to be the servant of the state rather than its owner. It was a fascinating experiment in top-down modernity, driven by the belief that a single educated ruler could enact reforms more efficiently than a messy, slow legislature.
And you had rulers like Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph II of Austria, all trying to do this.
Frederick the Great explicitly stated his occupation was to combat ignorance and prejudice, to enlighten minds, cultivate morality, and to make people as happy as it suits human nature.
That sounds incredibly noble, but was trying to be enlightened while still maintaining absolute power, ultimately a contradiction in terms.
It was a profound contradiction, and the results were very mixed. While some reforms did get enacted, like abolishing torture in some places, the underlying power structure often resisted any deep change.
Joseph II of Austria is a great example. He was known for his extreme overenthusiasm.
He was. He announced all these radical reforms, almost overnight religious tolerance, the abolition of serfdom. But they lacked popular support from the entrenched nobility or even from the peasantry themselves.
And the consequence of that overreach.
Widespread revolts across his empire. It really demonstrated the limits of imposing rationalism without getting any buy-in. And so most of his progressive programs were just reversed after his death. It confirmed that even the most rational reforms couldn't survive if they didn't respect existing customs or social power dynamics.
But the ideals themselves, regardless of how they were applied in royal courts, they were just too potent to remain contained. The Enlightenment is universally recognized as the intellectual foundation of modern Western political culture.
And it leads directly to the Age of Revolutions. The American Revolution in 1776 is a primary example of Lockean ideas being put into practice.
You had figures like Benjamin Franklin, who spent a lot of time in Europe bringing back the newest ideas, and Thomas Jefferson, who incorporated these ideals directly into the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
And the American effort was heavily focused on breaking free from a government, King George III and Parliament, that they felt didn't adequately represent their interests or protect their pre-existing Lockean rights.
In a way, it was a conservative revolution. They were fighting to preserve rights they believed they already possessed.
Contrast that with the French Revolution in 1789. The sources are clear that the ideas of the Philosophers systematically undermined the legitimacy of the old regime, the ancien regime.
With its rigid social hierarchy and absolute monarchical power, this was a radical revolution. It wasn't just about protection. It was about creating a fundamentally new, equal society from scratch.
Exactly. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he analyzed it decades later, he suggested the revolution was the inevitable result of this radical opposition that emerged between the monarchy and the men of letters.
These intellectuals, he argued, became a kind of substitute aristocracy.
Right. They were all powerful in the realm of public opinion, but they had no real political accountability, and their relentless promotion of a discourse of equality was just fundamentally opposed to the monarchical regime, which led to its violent collapse.
So whether it was through constitutional founding in America or violent upheaval in France, the 18th century's political thought replaced inherited authority with reason, consent, and rational law, and it just changed the course of governance forever.
The political transformation we just discussed, it really required an equally dramatic shift in how people viewed the world. Specifically, it meant challenging the long-standing authority of the church.
And this intellectual shift was perfectly encapsulated by Immanuel Kant's famous challenge to his contemporaries. Sapere, aude.
Dare to know, or dare to think for yourself.
That challenge was absolutely essential, wasn't it? The Enlightenment was, in many ways, this massive intellectual and political response to the previous century of horrific religious conflict in Europe.
Especially the 30 Years' War. The sources really emphasized that the goal was simple but radical. Curtail the political power of organized religion and prevent future religious wars fueled by doctrinal disputes.
For the moderate reformers, this meant simplifying faith, reducing it to its moral and rational core.
John Locke's reasonableness of Christianity is a perfect example. He recommended that people just focus on the fundamental, simple belief in Christ the Redeemer and avoid getting bogged down in these detailed, often conflicting theological debates that had fueled so much bloodshed.
Thomas Jefferson took this rationalization impulse to its absolute extreme. He created the Jefferson Bible
He literally took scissors and glue.
and cut out any passages dealing with miracles, the virgin birth, visitations of angels, the resurrection, anything supernatural. He wanted to extract what he saw as the pure, practical Christian moral code, stripped of everything that required faith over reason.
And this impulse to rationalize faith, it opened the door to entirely new religious ideas that relied purely on reason. The most popular among the intellectual elites was deism.
The simple belief in a God the Creator who acted as a sort of grand architect of a scientifically ordered universe.
A deist relies solely on personal reason. No reference to the Bible, miracles, or revelations. Thomas Paine was a major proponent of this view. He argued that the deist relies only on natural reason and observation to guide their creed and rejects the specific dogmas of the established churches.
And then, of course, you had the idea of atheism.
Which was widely discussed, but it had very few actual proponents at the time. Even many of the figures who were harshest in their criticism of Orthodox Christianity were only skeptics, or deists, or pantheists, not true atheists.
Voltaire, for instance, he feared that without the belief in a punishing God, the entire moral order of society would just collapse into anarchy.
That was the crucial sticking point for most of the mainstream Enlightenment figures. They believed morality was just inextricably linked to God. Locke argued that if there were no God and no divine law, the result would be moral anarchy.
Every individual would be a god to himself, with their own will as the sole measure of action.
But the radical thinkers, following the earlier thought of Pierre Bayle, they pushed back on this. Bayle and his followers argued that atheists could indeed be moral men. They could maintain concepts of honor, civic duty, and social good purely out of social interest and rational self-preservation.
Not out of fear of eternal consequences.
Right, and that argument was a crucial step in separating ethics from theology.
And the natural political conclusion of all this religious questioning was the push for the separation of church and state.
A concept that's often credited to John Locke, and which was really picked up and run with by the radical Enlightenment movement.
He developed this concept so powerfully within the framework of the social contract.
He argued that when people form a government, they can only cede powers they possess naturally. And since rational people can't cede control over their individual conscience or their inner belief to the government, it's an inalienable realm.
Then it logically follows that the government has no authority in the realm of faith.
Exactly. It created a natural right to liberty of conscience that has to be protected from any state authority.
And these views were immensely influential in the American colonies. They guided the drafting of the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
And you have Thomas Jefferson explicitly calling for a wall of separation between church and state at the federal level in his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association. It really solidified the application of this enlightened principle in the American Republic.
But the application of reason wasn't limited to theology and politics. It was applied to human behavior itself, which led to the birth of the modern social sciences.
Right. Thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment, especially David Hume, Adam Ferguson, and Adam Smith, they focused on creating a rigorous science of man.
This meant merging the philosophical study of human nature with a strong awareness of the social, economic, and historical forces that determine behavior.
And this focus on sociability, equality, and utility in Scotland is the direct origin of modern sociology and anthropology.
And in the realm of wealth, 1776, the same year as the American Declaration, saw Adam Smith truly establish the field of modern economics with the publication of The Wealth of Nations.
And that work had an immediate and continuing impact on British economic policy. It championed the principles of laissez-faire free markets, minimal government intervention, the invisible hand.
Smith's emphasis on the division of labor and specialization, showing how collective wealth is created, it provided a rational, scientific justification for commercial society.
The legal system also saw a revolutionary critique based purely on reason. Cesar Beccaриa's 1764 masterpiece on crimes and punishments is considered a founding work in penology and classical criminology.
Beccaria argued that the justice system of his day was just irrational, cruel, and ineffective. He condemned the use of torture, arguing that it only guaranteed that the strong or guilty would survive while the weak or innocent would confess under duress.
And he fiercely condemned the death penalty. His core argument was that punishment must be certain, prompt, and proportionate to the crime. It should only serve to deter future offenses, not to exact some kind of religious vengeance or brutal spectacle.
The certainty of a small punishment, he argued, was a more rational deterrent than the severity of a remote one.
His work was translated into 22 languages. It had an immediate and revolutionary impact on legal reform across Europe.
So from challenging the divine source of morality to rationally structuring society and law, the Enlightenment just utterly transformed the three pillars of civilization: faith, law, and wealth. Now, for ideas to actually challenge entrenched power structures, they have to circulate. They have to move effectively and rapidly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the Enlightenment wasn't just about brilliant individuals writing books in isolation. It was a vast cultural movement, and it was powered by new, highly effective channels of dissemination and communication.
The intellectual elite, they operated primarily within what they called the Republic of Letters.
A term coined by Pierre Bayle back in 1664. It described this kind of imaginary egalitarian realm that was governed by shared knowledge and acted across political and national boundaries.
It sounds like an early, borderless intellectual network, relying on letters, journals, personal travel.
It was a forum dedicated to the free public examination of everything, from theological arguments to new forms of government.
And women played an absolute crucial role in this, didn't they? Especially as saloniers in the Parisian salons.
Their role was indispensable. They acted as the legitimate governors of the intellectual discourse. They set the tone, chose the topics, mediated disputes, and made sure the debate was polite and rational.
The salons became the primary civil working spaces for the entire project of the Enlightenment.
They hosted discussions among the greatest minds of the day. Diderot, Rousseau, Voltaire, they were all there.
But while the established men of letters, the successful philosophers, operated in this elite, polite sphere, there was a far more venomous, oppositional literary realm bubbling up from underneath.
Yes, Grub Street. This was the domain of poorly paid, bitter writers, the Grub Street hacks, who were marginalized by the official, censored publishing guilds.
They were highly educated but perpetually poor, and they fed their resentment by turning their intellectual skills toward highly subversive literature.
They found their outlet in these critical pamphlets called libels.
And these libels, they weren't discussing abstract political theory. They were pure, often vulgar character assassination.
They slandered the court, the church, the aristocracy, the academies, the salons, everything elevated and respectable, including the monarchy itself.
The historian Robert Darnton argues that this oppositional literary sphere was absolutely critical. He says the high-minded Enlightenment taught people how to think.
But Grub Street provided the targets. By relentlessly attacking royal mistresses, financial corruption, and the moral hypocrisy of the clergy with these sensationalist stories, they effectively desacralized authority in the eyes of the common educated reader.
Which paved the way for revolutionary sentiment.
It did. And the ability of this literature, whether as elite or subversive, to even reach the public was due to a dramatic shift in print culture. People call it the reading revolution.
Increased efficiency in production lowered prices drastically. So you have this explosion of books, pamphlets, journals.
And literacy rates just shot up. They actually doubled in France over the 18th century alone.
And the reading revolution itself changed how people interacted with ideas. Before 1750, reading was intensive.
Right. People owned only a few books, a Bible, an almanac, and they read them repeatedly, often aloud in groups. But after 1750, the trend became extensive.
Many books read once, quickly and crucially, read alone.
And this shift meant knowledge consumption became more individual and private, which fosters a spirit of critical thinking. When you read the same book over and over, you internalize authority.
But when you read dozens of different books, you start to compare, contrast, and criticize.
And that hunger for reading reached far beyond the elite. There's evidence of lower class engagement, particularly with the Bibliothèque Bleue, the Blue Library.
These were cheaply produced books published in Troyes, France, specifically targeted at a rural and semi-literate audience. They had simplified almanacs, practical advice, condensed novels.
Now, censorship, of course, was rampant, especially in France. The government tried desperately to control the flow of ideas,
Which led to many publishing companies just relocating outside of France to places like Geneva or the Netherlands and then smuggling materials back across the border.
And what's really telling is what readers actually bought clandestinely. Records of smuggled books show that people weren't only after Locke and Rousseau.
They were highly interested in sensationalist stories about corruption, pornography, and those political libels. It shows a huge commercial demand for this lowbrow, subversive literature that was undermining the regime.
That the single greatest engine for synthesizing and disseminating Enlightenment ideas has to be the encyclopedia.
Oh, absolutely monumental. Compiled by Denis Diderot, Jean-Laurent de Lambert, and 150 contributors, it spanned 35 volumes. It wasn't just a list of facts, it was a weapon for spreading enlightened thought across Europe.
And the structural organization alone was radical. Diderot's figurative system of human knowledge organized everything into three main branches: memory, reason, and imagination.
And wait, he placed theology next to black magic. That is an astonishing editorial choice. How did they get away with that?
That was the genius of their subtle defiance. By
Right.
putting theology on a peripheral branch right next to superstition and divination, they were implicitly critiquing the church's traditional monopoly on truth.
It was a structurally secularizing project. It suggested theology was just another field of human inquiry, and a flawed one at that.
The success was immense, despite repeated attempts by the church and state to ban it. Estimates suggest around 25,000 copies were circulating before the French Revolution. It just systematized the new rational worldview.
But these ideas didn't just spread through books. They thrived in physical spaces of social interaction. They fostered what we call the public sphere.
This rational, critical realm that was independent of state or church authority, founded on shared reason and debate.
We've already mentioned the salons as these vital elite spaces, but equally important were the coffeehouses and cafes.
The coffee houses in London were called penny universities. For the cost of a cup of coffee, anyone could get access to conversations with doctors, lawyers, merchants, and read the latest pamphlets.
There were also the nerve centers for Brutes Publics, or public rumor, which was often considered a more reliable source of information than the official censored newspapers.
And what's so unique about them is their cross-class appeal. They attracted this diverse clientele, which actually sparked fear among nobles who wanted to preserve rigid class distinctions.
The famous Café Procope in Paris, established way back in 1686, that was the unofficial office where Diderot and D'Alembert made the crucial decision to create the encyclopedia.
And beyond the cafes, you had debating societies. These were commercial enterprises that often welcomed huge crowds, maybe 800 to 1,200 spectators a night, as long as they paid the entrance fee.
And they were open to all classes and both genders. They discuss everything: religion, politics, the role of women. The enforced anonymity of the submissions and the egalitarian nature of the debate helped spread these ideas to a vast audience.
And finally, you have the highly secretive but internationally influential Masonic lodges. Figures like Diderot, Voltaire, Franklin, Washington, they were all members.
They promoted the core Enlightenment ideals, liberty, fraternity, equality, in a private, non-state setting.
And crucially, they provided a private model for constitutional self-government, with constitutions and elections, which was inherently political, especially in continental Europe where such practices were illegal.
Their international reach meant they were an undeniable force in diffusing this culture of reasoned, critical thought.
This whole section really proves that the Enlightenment was a total cultural project. A new philosophy, a new science, a new economy, and a new structure of public life, all working in concert.
What's so fascinating about the Enlightenment is that it wasn't this, monolithic thing that just marched across Europe. It adapted locally. It created these distinct national variations.
Right. The ideas were adopted and modified to solve local problems. In France, La Lumière became highly associated with anti-government and anti-church radicalism.
Which was largely due to the hostility of the centralized monarchy and the strength of that radical Enlightenment we talked about earlier.
But in contrast, Germany's De-Aufklärung reached deep into the middle classes, and it had a much more spiritualistic and nationalistic tone. It was less threatening to the established churches and governments.
It was more focused on self-improvement, reason, and moral cultivation, rather than on democratic revolution.
Exactly. And the German movement included major figures like Goethe, Herder, and Schiller, who together formed the movement known as Weimar Classicism. Herder, for instance, argued that every group had its own unique identity, its Volksgeist, expressed in its language and culture.
Which legitimized the promotion of German nationalism as a form of intellectual progress.
And then there's Scotland, which was often described as a hotbed of genius. Voltaire famously said, "We look to Scotland for all our ideas of civilization."
The Scottish movement focused heavily on the practical application of ideas: sociability, equality, utility, and on creating that rigorous science of man we discussed with figures like David Hume and Adam Smith.
He was pragmatic and deeply concerned with moral improvement.
It's also so crucial to recognize the movement's reach beyond Western Europe. In Bourbon Spain and Spanish America, the era saw King Charles III implement these reforms that curtailed church power, promoted freer trade, and sponsored massive scientific expeditions.
Like the one supported by Alexander von Humboldt, to discover the economic potential and classify the natural resources of the empire.
And this political application of Enlightenment ideals, it culminated, however briefly, in the Spanish Constitution of 1812.
A document that established three branches of government and universal manhood suffrage, which was truly progressive for the time.
But it also explicitly excluded those with African ancestry, a critical, heartbreakingly early example of the limitations of these ideals when they were faced with economic and racial prejudice.
Which leads us to the more contemporary historical view, that the Enlightenment involved extensive cross-border interaction and global integration. It wasn't just ideas spreading from Europe, but a shared international phenomenon where non-European actors adapted and used the ideas for their own purposes.
You just have to look at Haiti. The Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history, was led by Toussaint Louverture.
And he mobilized radical Parisian ideas and fused them with the specific lived experiences of African-born slaves. Louverture had read the critique of European colonialism. He was thoroughly versed in the language of rights.
And the resulting revolution was so powerful that it forced the French National Convention to abolish slavery in 1794. The Haitian Revolution is the ultimate example of the Enlightenment's radical ideals being taken more seriously by the oppressed than by the oppressors who wrote them down.
And in Asia, you see this profound fusion of local traditions with Enlightenment concepts. In Japan, for example, the Confucian idea of ri, which means order and harmony, was co-opted and adapted to represent laissez-faire economics and social order.
And the potent slogan, civilization and enlightenment, was used across Japan, China, and Korea by the 1880s to address the challenges of modernization and globalization.
They weren't just adopting Western thought belatedly. They were using the language of reason and progress to advance their own specific localized purposes and internal reforms. Even in India, you had figures like Tipu Sultan, an enlightened monarch and a founding member of the French Jacobin Club.
And Ram Mayahoy of the Bengal Renaissance, who promoted reforms based on a religion of reason, demanding reforms to traditional Hindu society.
The ideas were invoked by historical actors all around the world to modernize their societies and achieve sovereignty. It proved that reason and liberty were universal concepts, even if their European originators really struggled to apply them universally.
Which means we cannot complete this deep dive without seriously acknowledging the darker side and historical critique that shadows the Enlightenment. While the ideals promoted universal liberty, the application was often deeply flawed and hypocritical.
That is the essential contradiction we have to confront. Despite promoting universal liberty and human rights, the rights of women and non-white people were generally overlooked or explicitly curtailed.
Mary Wollstonecraft has a rare early exception. She argued fiercely in the Remeter, a vindication of the rights of women that women, like men, should be treated as rational beings who deserve equal education and political agency.
And the economic engine of many European nations relied directly on systems that contradicted every single espoused ideal of liberty. European nations refused to support anti-colonial struggles like Haiti's.
It demonstrated the practical limits of the ideology when faced with colonial profit and plantation economies. The system itself was fundamentally anti-Enlightenment, yet it was protected by the very governments espousing these rational ideals.
And most damningly, this era saw the emergence of scientific racism. Using the new research methods of the age classification, measurement, observation, thinkers systematically sought to categorize and rank human populations.
They used new research to classify non-European peoples as irrational and inferior, which effectively justified European dominance and the institution of slavery.
Thinkers debated concepts like monogenism, the idea that all races came from a single origin, Adam and Eve, but that some degenerated in polygenism, the idea that different races had separate origins, making them fundamentally unequal.
These concepts became popular intellectual debates used for social classification. They transformed old prejudices into new, supposedly scientific justifications for exploitation.
It's a stark reminder that the application of reason can be turned to horrific structural ends if the inherent biases of the practitioners are not questioned or checked by true universal compassion.
So what does this all mean when we synthesize the sources? I mean, at the end of the day, the Age of Enlightenment was characterized by this profound and radical transformation.
The substitution of reason, empirical inquiry, and individual conscience for traditional authority, for religious dogma, and for inherited privilege.
And the lasting legacies are just undeniable and structural. We're talking about constitutional government, the modern concept of universal human rights, however imperfectly it's been applied.
Free market economics, as defined by Adam Smith, and a widespread cultural reliance on print media and vigorous public debate to shape our collective life.
And the impact didn't just stop in 1804 with Kant's death. As the sources point out, all those 19th century movements like liberalism, neoclassicism, even the early foundations of modern sociology.
They all explicitly trace their entire intellectual heritage right back to this period. The structures of law and thought we inhabit today are, fundamentally, Enlightenment structures.
The Enlightenment aimed at liberating human beings from fear and superstition, installing them as masters of their own destiny through reason.
Yet the 20th century saw philosophers from the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, offer this searing critique. They argued that the wholly enlightened earth radiates under the sign of disaster triumphant.
Referencing the failures of the 20th century that grew out of the scientific rationalism of the 18th.
And this raises an important question for you, the listener. If the core promise of the Enlightenment was human progress through reason, to what extent did it ultimately succeed in truly eradicating fear, superstition, and inequality in the world? Or did it merely introduce new, more sophisticated, and perhaps more dangerous forms of all three, just cloaked in the legitimacy of science and logic?
Welcome to the debate. Today, we're turning our attention to one of the most foundational and I think most fiercely argued periods in modern history, the Age of Enlightenment. It spans roughly the century from the late 1600s through the French Revolution in 1789. And it's an era that, well, it really championed reason, individual liberty, and the systematic idea of progress.
And while the fundamental principles are widely celebrated, the core philosophical and political nature of the movement itself remains highly contested.
Indeed. The central question for us today is whether the Enlightenment was primarily a radical force, one that was fundamentally dedicated to overthrowing tradition, dismantling the church, and restructuring all existing political authority, or, on the other hand, was it a moderate movement, a more pragmatic pursuit of gradual reform and accommodation within the established frameworks of government and religion? Was it a hammer or a scalpel?
And I will be arguing that while the intellectual critique was undoubtedly sharp, the widespread and politically dominant form of the movement across 18th century Europe was overwhelmingly moderate. It was focused on gradual controlled reform and political stability, often achieved through pragmatic collaboration with absolute monarchs.
And my position is firm. The enduring intellectual heritage of the Enlightenment was inherently radical. Its foundational texts and its ultimate long-term consequences aimed at revolutionary transformation, even if that transformation was often resisted or delayed by the powers of the day. So, to begin, let's look under the hood. What was really powering this intellectual revolution? When we talk about the most uncompromising thinkers, the ones who truly define the trajectory of modernity, we are talking about what the historian Jonathan Israel has termed the radical Enlightenment. And this current was deeply inspired by the philosophy of Baruch Spinoza.
Right.
Spinoza's ideas were politically explosive. And they were explosive because they offered a pantheistic view of God, that God is nature, which completely eliminated the need for an external, transcendent religious authority. This intellectual move provided the basis for a complete separation of morality from theology, and it radically undermined the divine right of kings. The advocates of this strain, well, they pushed explicitly for democracy, for full individual liberty, and for freedom of expression. This is a complete rupture with the past, not an attempt at accommodation. Furthermore, the very methodology of the era, famously articulated by Kant, urged humanity toward sapere aude, dare to know. This was a rallying cry to emancipate human consciousness. It demanded that we subject all inherited authority, religious dogma, monarchical privilege, social hierarchy, to critical, rational examination. When you apply that kind of universal rationality to every single problem, The result is inherently revolutionary. Just look at the American Revolution and the subsequent systematic dismantling of the Ancien regime in France. They show this radical potential beautifully.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the radical fringe defined the political reality of the 18th century. That radical current, while certainly intellectually potent, was often confined to philosophical circles. It was censored, and it was relegated to the margins of real political power. The moderate variety of the Enlightenment, which was far more widespread and, I would argue, more politically successful, it followed different figures. Descartes, Locke in his more constrained capacity, Christian Wolff in Germany, and it consciously sought compatibility between reform and traditional structures.
But that's a compromise of the core idea.
Well, let me finish. The strongest evidence for moderation is found in its institutional success. The most visible, most effective application of Enlightenment thinking in the 18th century was enlightened absolutism. And these weren't minor states. We're talking about the major powers: Frederick the Great of Prussia, Catherine the Great of Russia, Joseph II of Austria. These monarchs, they sought out philosophers. They implemented significant reforms, modernizing legal codes, promoting religious tolerance, rationalizing the state bureaucracy. But, and this is the key distinction, they did this to build stronger, more efficient states, not to build republics. They used reason as a management tool. Voltaire, a titan of the French Lumières, he exemplified this. He explicitly despised the idea of democracy, viewing the common people as too ignorant for self-governance. He believed the ideal ruler was simply an absolute monarch who was enlightened, one who acted based on reason and justice, but who maintained absolute power. This is the very definition of a pragmatic, non-revolutionary political goal.
I acknowledge that many regimes resisted the full implications of radicalism. Of course, censorship was rife. And the French crown was certainly hostile to many philosophies. But we have to be careful not to confuse what was politically convenient at the time with the long-term true power of the philosophical critique. The fact that the ideas themselves fundamentally undermine the authority of the monarchy and religious officials is the crucial point. Look at the discourse itself. Alexis de Tocqueville, in analyzing the political literature of the French philosophies, he observed that their persistent, abstract arguments for universal equality fundamentally opposed the entire legitimacy of the old regime. The move from viewing political power as derived from divine right to viewing it as dependent upon the consent of the governed, as articulated by Locke and Rousseau, that is not a measured reform.
That is a fundamental, radical transformation of the very basis of political legitimacy. Whether the practical revolution took decades or centuries to materialize, that doesn't negate the revolutionary nature of the intellectual shift.
That is a powerful analysis, but it seems to miss the messy political reality. We see that when attempts were made at immediate radical overhaul, they were profoundly destabilizing. They were often unsustainable. Take Joseph II of Austria. He was perhaps the most ideologically committed of the enlightened despots, announcing these sweeping decrees, from abolishing serfdom to reorganizing the church. And the result? Widespread revolt, resistance from the nobility, from the church. His reign became a comedy of errors, and nearly all his radical programs were reversed upon his death. This suggests that true, immediate, radical political application was often just too volatile to sustain, which reinforced the need for controlled, slow-moving moderation. And you can contrast that with the German Aufklärung. This was a successful movement precisely because it was integrated deeply into society, focusing on moral improvement and building a sense of nationhood, all while supporting the standing order. It achieved reform without ever threatening governments or established churches. When reform is successful and sustained, it's generally because it's controlled by the sovereign and therefore fundamentally moderate.
But the success of those controlled reforms, even if implemented by an emperor, they were built on principles that were at their root inherently radical. I'm talking about the core concepts of individual liberty and natural rights. These concepts, life, liberty, and property, according to Locke, are philosophical tools designed to fundamentally limit the reach of government authority. They form the foundation of modern Western political culture precisely because they introduce a zone of individual autonomy that the state cannot legitimately breach. The core radical push wasn't just about political structure. It was the application of rationality to every sphere of human experience. When you insist that all authority must justify itself before the tribunal of reason, you challenge the very premise of inherited, unearned authority. And that methodological shift is revolutionary, even if specific political applications were tentative.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame the ambiguity of those core concepts differently. I find that even foundational principles like natural rights show the limits of radical purity. They demonstrate the accommodations made to political power. You cite Locke on natural rights as the radical foundation, yet even he, the champion of liberty, introduced a notable caveat. While he argued against absolute slavery in principle, he permitted the enslavement of a lawful captive in time of war. Now, this seemingly minor exception demonstrates that even at the conceptual level, these thinkers were making pragmatic accommodations to existing power structures. And let's also consider the concept of property in his triad. For many of the moderate British Whig thinkers who adopted Locke, protecting established property rights became paramount. This focus reinforced the established social hierarchy and served to limit, rather than expand, radical democratic participation. So the philosophy was easily co-opted and moderated by those in power.
I'm not convinced that focusing on the inconsistencies of one figure or the conservative interpretations of one concept really captures the expansive, boundary-breaking nature of the ideas. We often fall into the trap of analyzing the Enlightenment solely as this singular European academic phenomenon. And recent scholarship has profoundly challenged that narrow view, highlighting the Enlightenment as a response to global interaction and cross-border critiques.
But that global fragmentation you mentioned, however, actually reinforces the argument for moderation. The idea of a singular, radical Enlightenment just ignores the highly fragmented nature of the movement across national lines. Look at the English case. Leading intellectuals like Edward Gibbon, Samuel Johnson, and especially Edmund Burke were generally conservative. They staunchly supported the established order. And why? Because the English Enlightenment had largely succeeded early on in establishing a moderate political liberalism and religious toleration through the Glorious Revolution. There was simply no need for a radical philosophical overthrow. In fact, after 1789, figures like Burke became the most articulate counter-revolutionaries in Europe, using their moderate Enlightenment principles to actively defend traditional institutions against what they saw as the radical excesses of the French Revolution.
This shows the movement could become a force for stability, entirely comfortable with the established framework.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. One that's rooted in those very global interactions that I think prove the ideas were inherently radical. Consider the Haitian Revolution. This was not a revolt led by European courtiers seeking incremental reforms. Here, radical ideas from the French Revolution, universal liberty, human equality, were mobilized, weaponized by enslaved people. Figures like Toussaint Louverture, who read René's powerful critique of colonialism, they used these Enlightenment concepts to achieve the systematic and immediate overthrow of a colonial system built entirely on chattel slavery. The Haitian Revolution was an uncompromising, full-scale transformation that happened precisely because the core ideas possessed a universal and uncompromising potential. The radical core was always there, ready to be ignited by those on the receiving end of European power.
This proves that the moderate veneer adopted in European courts was a matter of convenience, not conviction.
That is an undeniably powerful counterexample, and it does illustrate the revolutionary potential when those ideas escape the filtering mechanisms of state power. But when we look at the Age of Enlightenment in the context of the political structures that defined 18th century Europe, the story remains one of moderation. The vast majority of people were still governed by monarchs who at best tolerated rational governance in the name of efficiency. The Age of Enlightenment was characterized less by universal revolution and more by widespread locally adapted attempts at rational administration. The historical dominance of enlightened absolutism and the intellectual tradition of figures like Descartes and Wolff demonstrate that many powerful currents sought to utilize reason for incremental change, often in accommodation with, not in opposition to, the existing authorities.
Conversely, the Enlightenment, viewed through its foundational texts, those Spinozist arguments for philosophical liberty, Rousseau's commitment to popular sovereignty, Kant's demand for universal critique, and its ultimate long-term political impact was fundamentally defined by a deep intellectual commitment to radical transformation. It led directly, if sometimes indirectly and unevenly, to the great Atlantic revolutions, and it continues to shape global movements today that seek to subject inherited authority to the tribunal of reason. That core philosophical challenge is inherently revolutionary and, I believe, defines the era's lasting legacy.
Ultimately, we are discussing the tension between intellectual theory and political stability. The Age of Enlightenment was both the source of radical, world-changing critique and the era of measured, pragmatic political practice. Understanding the success and the sheer prevalence of the moderate, controlled reforms implemented by monarchs like Frederick and Catherine remains essential for understanding how foundational ideas are translated into political action. The way these concepts were adapted for state efficiency rather than immediate liberty highlights the complexity of this pivotal century and demonstrates that not every push for reason is a push for revolution. And this dynamic tension ensures that the debate over the Enlightenment's true nature will and should continue.